Today we're going to cover three examples of AJAX. Actually, we're going to just review one of them and cover two more examples of AJAX. Before we talk about the specifics in the examples, I want to make sure we really understand what AJAX is and think of some examples that exist that you more than likely have seen. Classic one that I went over last time is where you do a Google search, and as you type in letters, it narrows down the search based on popularity of that search term. And it's customized then based on, in this case, your location. Notice how all these are within the general vicinity of Northern Ohio. That leads us to conclude that this is done on the server. And yet it's appearing on the page without refreshing the entire page. And therefore the client must be involved at all. And we talked last time about the whole setup where the client makes a request to a server, but it's a different kind of request. It's a request for some data, not a request for a web page. Therefore, it does not get back an entire web page. It gets back a chunk of data, and that data is then used when it comes back to fill in the results. So let's copy over the example that we went over last time. Maybe. There we go. So we saw when we did this initially how you could do a calculator that we put in a value and it goes to a brand new page. But with this example, it just refreshes the current page. We saw two examples of doing that. Most of the work for this happens on the client side, by the way, because the client side is responsible for both making the request and doing something with the output. As we saw last time, let's look at the code here. In this example, when the button is clicked, we've already created the request object. When the button is clicked, we validate the form. If it's valid, we make the AJAX call. The AJAX call consists of defining the request. The request consists of a URL, and that can include pieces of data. So in this case, we're concatenating on the age and the number of beats on the query string. We then get the URL and we specify that we call the function handle response when the status changes, and then we make the request. When the status changes, we get the result back from the server and we display it in the results field. The results back from the server are simply going to pull the value from here. We're going to make sure there's a value for the age and for the beats. And then we call the in range function. And based on whether the results are -1, 0, or 1, we say we're below the optimal range, in the optimal range, or above the optimal range. Now, here's a key thing with this. All right. This relies on having common code. In other words, if we look at this in whole, I do not have a different function. The function that calculates the minimum and the maximum occur in one place. So this chart calls to do its thing. It calls the functions that are in heart INC. So as we're looping through, we call calculate minimum heart rate, calculate maximum heart rate. And that is included in the heart INC. So within this application, there is only one place where the maximum heart rate is calculated and the minimum heart rate is calculated. That's these functions that appear in heart. And those functions are used throughout the application. In check range AJAX, we call the function in range, which is in heart. And in range simply calls the maximum and the minimum as well. So there's no duplicate code. Nowhere in this is a code that says that your maximum heart rate should be your maximum exercise heart rate should be 0.8 times your maximum heart rate. That only exists in one place. Here's the calculation of the maximum heart rate, which is 220 minus your age. Here's the calculation of your maximum exercise heart rate, which is 0.8 times that. That's very important as you go ahead and complete these assignments. All right. Make sure that the actual calculation of tuition is done only in one place. And you should make those functions work for chart and for the calculator. And here we make it work for AJAX by having the check range AJAX do its thing and only return one of these three values. Either print your below, in, or above maximum heart range. So all your pages should be calling the same sets of functions. If you have the calculation for tuition in two places, then you need to change it. Some of you did a great job on the first part of it where you created the calculator. However, your code was embedded in that calculator page. Those functions should be included. Those calculations should be in functions, and those functions should be included in include files. So that way multiple pages can use those. So anywhere in our application where we need to calculate tuition, we can do it with that one include file and the functions contained. So when you're reviewing this example, review and notice how these calculations are used throughout the entire little mini calculation. Anytime we want to find out if they're in the range, we call this function. Only one place. We don't have duplicate code elsewhere. DRY, dry, is a programmer motto. That means do not repeat yourself. Now that takes a little bit of work to do, and that takes a little bit of planning. And if you haven't done it for the first calculator, you're going to need to sort of retrofit it so that you can do it for the table when you create the table of tuitions in your assignment. But that's a critical key thing in programming, is the ability to write functions so that you're not duplicating effort, you're not duplicating code, you're simply calling functions from different places on different pages. That's how the calculator works for AJAX. We create a request object, that's the pipeline. When we submit when we say to do the calculation, we first validate the form. If the form's okay, we make the AJAX call. The AJAX call defines the request, puts the data on the query string, makes a request, and says what function is going to handle the results. Handling the results checks the ready state. A ready state of 4 on the pipeline means that the server process is done and the value has been returned. So we're going to take that response and put it in the answer. All right, we can test this a piece at a time. That's what I would suggest doing. First thing I'm going to do is make sure I got the URL right. So I think I showed you this last time. I can actually put an alert in here or log. If you don't remember how to log, like I'm drawing a blank today, JavaScript log to console, and it is console.log. So I can put in here console.log URL, and I can actually see the URL that gets called. The console. And unexpected token. I did a colon instead of a semicolon. I can see that is the function that gets called. I can then check the server-side code to make sure it is working correctly. And my PHP is not working. Interestingly enough. Notice how it was just returning the code. Oh, this is a good question, why this is not working. Let me look to see what I messed up in the code. console log URL. Oh, I think I changed. Wow. I'm going to assume that I screwed up this page, and I am going to copy stuff over to the server. Either that or I had some kind of server crash, all of which are possible. There we go. We're working again. All right. I can put in here the name of the script after I log it. And here and edit. As I was saying before, I can put in here the URL and make sure that it logs the URL that I'm expecting to see. I'm expecting to see the URL being check ranged ajax.php and the age and the number of beats tacked onto it. Now, when I do that and look at the console, I see I get this. I want to verify this works. I can actually paste this URL and see what I get. Make a regular request to that page, not an AJAX request to the page, and see what it returns back. And sure enough, it returns back simply this little snippet of code. So there's ways of debugging it. Make sure you're sending the URL. Make sure that the URL that is being sent produces the results that you expect it to. We had a similar thing with the jQuery version of this. It does sort of the same thing. Forming the URL, much the same way. Making the request of the URL. And if there is success, calling this function right here. And that function is defined in line. And all we're doing is taking the results back from AJAX and putting it in there. I don't care which method you use for your assignments. You can either use the plain JavaScript version or the AJAX version. All right. Let's look at our next example, which is a quiz. Now let's think this through. Why would I want to have a quiz be done via AJAX? Well, because I would want the grading to be done server side. I don't want the grading to be done client side because then to cheat, all someone would have to do is look at the source code and know the answers. Therefore, I put the grading of this on the server. Yet I want to be able to show next to their answers what they got right, what they got wrong, without having to redraw the whole page. So I created this quiz, and this is how this quiz works. There's some simple math questions here that I can answer. I'm going to get some wrong and some right on purpose. So I got the first one wrong. I got the rest of them right, I think. And it tells me that my grade is 75%. Right? Get it right. So the grade's 100%. Let's see how we do that here. First of all, my index page actually generates questions. So when this page loads, I have in here an include file called questions. When the page loads, I display the form, and the form goes and loops through an array that I have and writes out the questions and creates an input text box for the answer. The text box is named answer sub I. So it will be answer sub 0, answer sub 1, answer sub 2. I have a span for an error message. And there we go. This is dynamically generated based on the values in questions include file. If I want to add another question to it, all I have to do is make sure I put both of these values in here. And the next time I run the quiz, it'll add that question to the list. I get that answer, and it's included in part of the grading. Now I use that same include file for both the grading and the display to make sure that I'm grading the right questions. %. I got 4 of them right. All right, so we're looping through, we're creating a form tag, we're creating the question by looping through the array and displaying this plus this equals, and then finally we're creating a text box named answer sub 0, sub 1, sub 2 for that. So like when we first load this page, we can view the source and see the HTML that got generated. 1 plus 5, answer 0. Place to put the error for answer 0. Answer 1, answer 2, answer 3. Now let's review how the AJAX grading takes place. When they click the submit button, which is really not a submit button, it calls grade quiz. Grade quiz counts the number of questions there are. It loops through for each question and forms query string by adding in answer sub and the value from that element on the form. So I could put an alert URL here and see the URL that it calls. Make sure it's right. Grade PHP, answer 1 equals empty string, answer 2, answer 0 equals empty string, answer 1 equals empty string, and so on. Let me put some values in so we can see the values too. Answer grade PHP, answer 0 equals 5, answer 1 equals 23, and so on down the line. So that is the URL that gets called to grade this. When the server responds, the answer comes back in a variable called handle response, or the function handle.response gets, or handle response gets called. We look here and we see we can put an alert up to see what we get returned from the server, because that variable is going to be in response text. Handle response, remember, I misstated that, is not a function, is a function. It's a function that gets called when the server is done processing this. Actually, every status change. We get an answer saying whether they got each question right or wrong. So I got all of them wrong, so it's n, comma, n, comma, n, comma, n. The reason I do that is that's the most complete way that I can respond to the grading the quiz, is specify whether they got each question right or wrong. That way, I could display which questions they got right and which questions they got wrong, or I could simply calculate the percent. And that's what I do. I split that array, or that string, into an array. I then loop through, and for every question that I find, every answer in there, either a yes or no, I count, and for every right answer, I count the Y's. So when I'm done, I have how many questions there are and which ones I got right, how many I got right. I then calculate the percentage and display that. What does the grade do? Well, the grade simply loops through all the questions, however many questions there are, grabs the answer from the query string, calculates the right answer, and sees if the answer is right or not. If it's right, I print an N. If it's wrong, I print a, if it's right, I print a Y rather. If it's wrong, I print an N. And if I'm not on the last question, I print a question mark to separate them. So this is going to return a string of Y and Y comma N comma Y comma N comma, depending on how they got the questions right or wrong. We see the same formula for AJAX. Create the request object. Take and form the request. In this case, forming the request is a little complex because depending on how many questions we have, the query string is going to look longer or shorter. Less questions we have, less elements we're going to have on the query string. We start with the base URL, and each question we have, we add to the URL answer and the number of the answer and the value from the text box. And if it's not the last question, we add an ampersand to it. We then call that URL. We say when the status changes, call handle response. Handle response gets called. Every time it changes, the only one we're interested in, though, is the status of 4, which indicates that the server's done. And we can split that response text that we get back, which is a string of Y's and N's separated by commas. We get in results and an array. We can loop through that array, count up the number of questions, and count up how many of them are correct. Last example I want to go over today is a dictionary example. And this dictionary example is done 3 different ways. It's done delimited, JSON, and XML. Those are 3 ways that you can get data back from an AJAX request. You can either get it back in delimited format, which is what we saw in that graded example, the graded quiz example. Our answers that we got back, our yeses and nos, were separated by commas. Our answers were delimited by commas. The other format we have is JSON, which you should be familiar from the weather application. And finally, XML, which we have not talked about. Let me show you how this works, and then we will look at the code. We have a translation of mathematical terms from English to Spanish. So as we type in a mathematical term here, in the dropdown appears a list of all the English mathematical terms that start with that letter. As we type in more, it filters it more. If we select one from the list and click go, it gives me the Spanish translation. And it does it without refreshing the page, so we know it's AJAX. Now, in our case, we have an array of these terms. In a real application, we'd probably be looking these terms up from a database. This actually makes 2 AJAX requests. One to give us the list of words that match the pattern, one to give us the translation of the word that we select. In Dictionary INC, we have a list of the English terms and a list of the Spanish counterparts. Whole bunch of them. These are known as parallel arrays because for every element in one, there's an element in the other and they correspond. So if I want to look at the 5th element, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, additive inverse. His Spanish counterpart is the 5th element in that array. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's all this dictionary including contains. Now this one, we trigger when the user finishes pressing a key, on key up. This would be similar to like you have in applications like Twitter, where there is a character limit, where it counts down the how many characters you have left based on how many you've typed. So we're triggering this based on when the user presses a key and that key goes up. We call the function getWords, which forms a request. Make sure that, first of all, we selected that something was entered. We then go and call get dictionary1.php. That gives me a list of the words in the array that match that. In the query string element that we pass is called word, and it equals to the characters that we entered. When this changes, we create the dropdown. The dropdown, we get the response back. We split based on the semicolon or based on the colon. For each entry, then we split again based on the semicolon and create a drop-down option for the new combination. So in the drop-down, the English word is what's displayed. The index of that, in other words, whether it's a position 0, 1, 2, or 3, or whatever, is stored as the value of the drop-down. So let's type in console log. Place. Here's the URL that we call. Every time we press the key, we call that URL. And if I look at the console for that, I see dictionary1.php, word equals A. I type in AD. Oh, type the D here. Dictionary1, word equals AD. Type in another D. Word equals ADD, and so on down the line. Let's see what that gives us. If I call that by itself, which I can do, this is a server-side script, so I can call it and see what the server-side script returns. Oh, it's in a subfolder. It gives us this delimited list where each word is separated by a colon, and within each word there is a semicolon that separates the English word with the position in the array. So that's what I get back, a delimited value. Colons separate things into word groups or a block of words, the index and the word itself. And the semicolon separates those two parts. That's why I split this twice when I get the results. I split it once to get each word. I split it a second time to pluck out the index and the text of the word. And then I create this option based on what I have here. When I select a word and I get translation, I call this function, and it calls and it passes the index. Server then has a very easy job because what it does is it returns the Spanish value for that index. So if I picked the English word that has a position of 2, the translation is from the Spanish array that has an index of 2. Now there's 3 versions of this. There's the first version, which is delimited. There's a second version that uses JSON, and a third version that uses XML. The only real difference between these two is how the first request is handled, because I'm getting back different things. In this example, I'm getting back a XML. What is XML? XML is a format that is similar to HTML in that it uses tags to define what different data is. So in this case, I'm returning back a word list, and so I output a word list tag, and then I return for each item an item tag that contains a word and an index. That then gets processed by the client. And you can review the code, how that processes that. I would suggest for your assignment, probably best to do just the plain old delimited data, but I did want to show you that there are alternatives for more involved data that you can return either JSON or XML. All right, couple housekeeping things. This is the last lecture for this course, so there will not be any lectures next week, nor will there be any lectures on finals week. Please view the announcement in Canvas concerning office hours for the last 2 weeks of this course, and well, last 3 weeks of this course, this week, next week, and finals week. I've enjoyed this course. I hope you've enjoyed it too. Please ask me questions if you're running into difficulties about any of this. I realize that we covered AJAX kind of quickly. If you focus on the delimited examples, I think you can see and get enough of it to do the assignment. All right, that's all I had for today. I hope to see some of you later. Take care.